Good afternoon, everyone. And yeah, so to our non-project members, you've already heard so much today about the local project. This morning before the keynotes about the design of the project and the aims, and now this afternoon about the various approaches and the tools that were developed and tested by the project partners, as well as the teachers and the pupils, of course. And so all along, you've heard us refer to intellectual outputs, so IO 2, 3, 4. So these podcasts and modules and tutorials and the app, they're all different intellectual outputs of the local project. And all of this work culminates in intellectual output 5, IO 5, in which we take all of this knowledge and these experiences and resources and we package them into a set of concrete guidelines for introducing linguistic landscapes to language learning, as well as to teacher education and professionalization. And of course, after all this work, we want the project to live on, we want our efforts to live on. And so the guidelines are designed to support those who are thinking about or are wanting to use linguistic landscapes in their teaching. But also after all of this collaboration, so that we can take stock of what our project has achieved. So IO5, excuse me, my mouse decided to die on me this afternoon, so I have to fidget to go through the slides. There we go. IO5 is about these interconnected aims. It's about, not working, there we go. It's about us having a type of internal evaluation report in which we can provide a summary analysis of the quantitative and qualitative data collected through the previous intellectual outputs. So everything that you've just heard before this short presentation. And from all of this data, then we develop a set of recommendations for teachers and teacher educators to assist them in understanding the added value of approaching language learning strategies in broader contexts of linguistic and cultural diversity. And of course, these recommendations are illustrated throughout IO5 with concrete examples and practices. So the IO5 document has been drafted, and Lisa and I are going to summarize what this document contains so far. And we would ask you to keep in mind it is a work in progress, and we would love to hear your feedback and your comments before we send IO5 out into the world to grow and to be used by others. So the document contains 8 sections altogether. Here you can see the table of contents, and we're going to briefly address each section now. So every good text starts at the start, and so do we in our introduction. So there's nothing major to say here, just that we introduce the LoCALL project, the project goals, what the guidelines are about, namely introducing the reader to both the potential and the practicalities of using linguistic landscapes in education, and then of course what they can expect in the document. The first main content section deals with the question, what are linguistic landscapes? And this is always quite tricky, as this is such a rich and expanding research area. But with this document, we're not really writing a literature review in the classical sense. We're writing for practitioners for whom time is often a very scarce resource. And so in this chapter of IO5, we had to find a balance between doing justice to the breadth of research from which we derive our understandings of linguistic landscapes, while also keeping the text as accessible and as brief as possible. So we open this section by saying that the linguistic landscape is the display of languages in our surroundings. And we make the usual references to billboards and street signs and graffiti and posters, this definition that we've heard a number of times today. So it's fairly simple. If the linguistic landscape is all around us, it means it is accessible and it's immediately perceptible. And this is to make clear to the reader straight away that they don't require anything special to access or to use the linguistic landscape. But we promptly go on to say that developing a critical lens will allow them to observe these language displays in a much deeper and more reflective way, which can then lead to more equitable, reflective and plurilingual approaches to language education. Because language, of course, is used for different purposes in signage. It can be functional, it can be symbolic. And so we provide some examples of where linguistic landscaping has typically been conducted in the research. For example, we reference those officially bilingual societies or global cities or particular types of institutions, and how these studies reveal the complexity of the linguistic landscape, including who the sign makers are, what their agenda is, who they intend to address with their signs, etc. All the while making the point that by raising knowledge of the forms and functions of language around us, key skills for language acquisition, social communication, and intercultural competence can be developed. And so that's the point of getting the initial sort of conceptual and theoretical input on linguistic landscapes. So how this might be done concretely and in pedagogically sound ways is the topic of the next section, titled Integrating Linguistic Landscapes in the Classroom. And this section is divided into subsections from primary and secondary levels. I obviously don't need to tell this audience that we have to differentiate between the various levels of education in order to provide examples of the most appropriate activities. So for example, at primary level, we say that it's most important that the students become aware of the number and the diversity of languages that there are. And we make suggestions throughout the text for different activities and materials and how that can be done. And all of the references that we make to the LoCALL products and approaches are all hyperlinked throughout the text, along with the most relevant modules and podcasts, which are also hyperlinked. And then, of course, as learners get older and we move up through the educational levels, we describe those activities to develop more critical reflection, also activities that might incorporate more technologically sophisticated methods or other skills such as arguing, justifying, reflecting on the hierarchies, the power relations, etc. And again, all of the suggestions that we make in the different levels of education include links to the relevant materials. And then finally, in this section, we include a subsection on curricular requirements and cross-cutting activities, because some matters will affect all of the educational levels, such as adapting to the extant curriculum, depending on where you are, not just which level of education you're at, but different places have different curricula, of course, and cooperating with other teachers and colleagues. And we've just heard from Maria how important that is. So I'm very glad that we included it in the text. Now, Lisa, I'll hand over to you to continue with teacher professionalization. You just tell me when to click.
Yes, thank you. Okay, so we directly go over to teacher education and teachers' professional development. So we understand linguistic landscape as a tool to develop teachers' knowledge and skills, and we differentiate between different categories of this professionalization. And so the first part is the subject-specific knowledge, and we can see that through implementing linguistic landscapes in the teacher education or in the where teachers use linguistic landscape in their classroom, they get more knowledge about the target language and also meta-linguistic language. And what is a really important point is the awareness, the teacher's awareness of the different languages, of the diversity of languages and the contexts of language use, where it is really, the teachers become aware of the performative aspect of languages and of language learning. And also another very important point is the reflection and the reflective skills that are linked to it. Then concerning the subject-specific didactic knowledge, we can see that the teachers reconsider teaching methods and reflect on them. They introduce pluralistic approaches in the realm of plurilingual and multilingual pedagogies. And also we can observe that they work with authentic materials and that they value specifically this aspect. And also another point is the noticing of languages. Not only, I think Sylvia put it in the chat, it's not just seeing looking at the languages, but noticing them. And then finally, the general pedagogical psychological knowledge, that sounds very long. It means that the teachers, they can understand the heterogeneity and the plurilingual repertoires of their students or their selves and the society. And so they become engaged with multilingual pedagogies, and again they reflect, this is a very important point in the professionalization, they reflect on different areas and also on interdisciplinary teaching. And all this, it can be used also in teacher education. And here are some examples how linguistic landscapes can be used in teacher education. So we included in these guidelines a section called Dialogues with Other Projects. And so in one of this, Camilla, who's also here today, explains how she integrates linguistic landscapes in teacher education. And so I think the important part and that we want to share here is that there are 3 steps. You start with preparing and actively support students' personal experience with landscaping. You can use different apps such as the LinguSnap or other apps, other materials to really get to know the linguistic landscape. Then the next step would be to discuss the selected findings in some selected findings in detail in class. And then at the end, work in small groups on didactic scenarios for different target groups. So for primary education, for secondary education, or whatever is what the students are interested in and what they need now or in the future. And we also have another contribution by Nadja Kershofer, and she proposes a model for text work with linguistic landscapes. And she differentiates between two central ideas and 2 central sets of ideas that we have to consider when teaching or when working with linguistic landscapes. So, and she puts them together. So we have the question when we look at linguistic landscapes, the question of actors, of actions and attentions, and also which modes are used, which codes, which discourses are encouraged, and where do we find these linguistic landscapes, the place and the space. And we connect it to critical text work. So working on the text of the linguistic landscape and going beyond that. And then we can ask, okay, how are linguistic and non-linguistic means combined? Or which elements contribute to the meaning of the sign? We can also focus on the about, on the why questions, for example, what is being written or talked about and why, what topics, what perspectives, worldviews do the authors or readers have. Also connecting it with the discourse that comes out in linguistic landscapes. And yes, can you go back again? Sorry. And then she also focused on the question, where can these signs be found, and to connect it so with the place and space. And finally, for what what is the text intended to achieve? What should be the readers? What should the readers do, believe, or think? And to really get into this reflective into these reflections on language and on linguistic landscapes and on the society we're living in. Okay, thank you. Next slide is about the suggestions. So this is a section where we put some different ideas, suggestions together for policymakers, for teacher educators, and for teachers. And this is kind of a list, but it's not a complete list. So it's an open list that has to be filled in with your experiences, with your suggestions. And so these are just some ideas, for example, that policymakers can and should integrate interdisciplinary approaches and social agency, and for teacher educators to develop positive attitudes towards multilingual pedagogies. We saw this with what happened in Groningen to the students who work with linguistic landscapes and now decided to study the minority language and to really engage totally with the field. So this is an important aspect to really develop these positive attitudes, and also to collaborate with teachers when doing some work on linguistic landscapes in higher education, to combine it with experiences from teachers. And also another aspect that I think it was mentioned in the chat, the action-based research, the combination of action and of research. And finally, what we suggest for teachers is to engage with multilingual pedagogies and to make the students aware, and to instruct students to perceive, notice, and understand. And finally, to collaborate with colleagues. And we're going to the conclusions, which are also open, and the guidelines, I can just say it again. The guidelines are open, and feel free to add now in the discussion what you would like to add. And we also noticed during our work that the guidelines are centered on the European context. So we are looking forward to have a more inclusive and a more broad understanding of all the linguistic landscape work that can be done in this world. And finally, the guidelines have to be further developed and adapted to the minority language classroom and to the heritage language classroom. So far, this is it. And thank you very much. Danke sehr. And we are looking forward to the discussion and to your comments and ideas and feedback.